The cold Montana wind cut through my jacket as I stood before Uncle George's ranch. Keys dangled from my trembling fingers. The sprawling property stretched before me like a forgotten promise. Weathered buildings, overgrown pastures, and mountains looming in the distance. 3 months had passed since his funeral, but only yesterday had I finally gathered the courage to come claim my inheritance. My name is Nathan Reed. At 40, I'm a washed-up investigative journalist with a failed marriage and a career spiraling into obscurity. When my editor at the Denver Post suggested I take some time off to recalibrate, I knew it was the beginning of the end. 20 years of chasing stories across war zones and corporate scandals. And what did I have to show for it? A Pulitzer nomination that never materialized, a divorce decree, and now, unexpectedly, a ranch in Montana from an uncle I barely knew. The last time I saw Uncle George was 15 years ago at my father's funeral. He stood apart from everyone, a tall, weathered figure in a black suit that didn't quite fit, looking more like a reluctant pallbearer than family. We exchanged only a few words that day. "Your father was proud of you," he said, his calloused hand briefly gripping my shoulder. "Don't waste what he gave you." I didn't understand what he meant then. I'm not sure I do now. The wind gusted again, sending dust swirling around my boots. Uncle George had been a legend in journalistic circles back in the 70s and 80s, breaking stories about political corruption and corporate malfeasance when such reporting still had teeth. Then suddenly, at the height of his career, he disappeared from public life, retreating to this remote ranch. No one knew why. The few times I asked my father, his only response was a pained expression and a muttered, "Some stories cost too much." I pushed open the creaking front door and stepped into the musty darkness of what was now my home. Dust particles danced in the shafts of afternoon light, cutting through the drawn curtains. The house was modest but solid. A living room with well-worn furniture, a kitchen with ancient appliances, 2 bedrooms, and an office stacked with books and file boxes. Everything looked frozen in time, as if Uncle George had just stepped out and might return any moment. On the kitchen table sat a brown envelope with my name scrawled across it. Inside was a letter and a set of keys different from those the lawyer had given me. "Nathan, if you're reading this, I've finally run out of time. The ranch is yours along with everything in it. Some might say it's not much of a legacy, but there's value here beyond the property deed. The keys open the barn and my filing cabinets. Start there. There are truths waiting to be uncovered, and you're the only one left I can trust with them. Be careful who you talk to in town. Not everyone wants the past disturbed. You're a journalist, or at least you were. Remember what that means." The letter wasn't signed, but I recognized the sharp, decisive handwriting from birthday cards received long ago. The following morning, I drove into town to meet with Jessica Morgan, the local attorney handling Uncle George's estate. Her office occupied the second floor of a red brick building on Main Street above a hardware store that looked like it hadn't updated its inventory since the Reagan administration. Jessica Morgan was younger than I expected, mid-30s, with intelligent eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. She wore her blonde hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, and her handshake was firm and confident. "Mr. Reed, I'm glad you finally made it to Pinewood Valley," she said, gesturing toward a chair. "George was starting to think you'd never come. He was expecting me before he died. He mentioned several times that you'd be taking over the ranch someday." She pulled a file from her desk drawer. "He was quite specific about certain arrangements." "I barely knew him," I admitted. "We weren't close." "That may be," she replied, studying me carefully. "But he knew you, kept every article you ever published, had strong opinions about your work too." The revelation stunned me. While I'd been building my career chasing stories across the globe, Uncle George had been tracking my professional life from this remote corner of Montana. How did he die exactly? The lawyer in Denver was vague about the details. Heart attack, according to Dr. Pearson, found by his neighbor Tom Wilson when he didn't show up for their weekly chess game. Nothing suspicious, if that's what you're wondering. George was 78, lived alone, had a history of heart problems. She paused, her expression softening slightly. "Though between us, I always thought he seemed like a man waiting for something. Or someone." She handed me a stack of papers to sign explaining property taxes, water rights, and other practicalities of ranch ownership. As I signed the final document, she reached into her desk and withdrew a small manila envelope. "George left this with explicit instructions to give it to you personally after the estate was officially transferred." She slid it across the desk. I don't know what's in it. He sealed it in my presence. Inside was a single key and a note with an address in town. Storage unit number 17, Pinewood Valley Self-Storage. Some stories can't be kept at home. I looked up to find Jessica watching me intently. Did he leave anything else? Any messages? She shook her head. Just the paperwork in that envelope. Her professional mask slipped for just a moment, revealing something that looked remarkably like fear. But Mr. Reed, Nathan, there's something you should know about Pinewood Valley. It's a small town with a long memory. People here don't much care for outsiders digging into local history. Is that what George was doing? Digging into local history? I've already said more than I should. George was a good man who helped me when I was starting my practice. I owed him discretion then, and I owe him discretion now. She stood, signaling our meeting was over. Good luck with the ranch. If you need anything else regarding the estate, my door is always open. As I walked to my truck, I couldn't shake the feeling that everyone in this town knew something I didn't. The main street of Pinewood Valley seemed like a postcard image of rural Americana. A diner, a hardware store, a small library, and various shops that had probably been run by the same families for generations. Yet beneath the quaint facade, I sensed watchful eyes and whispered conversations. The storage facility was on the outskirts of town, a series of identical metal units surrounded by a chain-link fence. The elderly attendant barely glanced at me as I signed in, merely pointing toward the row containing Unit 17. The padlock opened with a satisfying click. I rolled up the metal door to reveal a space about 10 feet square, illuminated only by the daylight filtering in behind me. As my eyes adjusted, I made out several stacks of file boxes, a metal filing cabinet, and what appeared to be photography equipment covered in dust cloths. I started with the nearest box labeled simply 1989 to 1991. Inside were notebooks, cassette tapes, newspaper clippings, and folders full of what looked like research materials, all meticulously organized and labeled in Uncle George's distinctive handwriting. The notebooks contained interview transcripts, observations, and what appeared to be the foundation for investigative articles that, as far as I knew, were never published. Names appeared repeatedly: Blackwood Harrison, Watkins Reynolds. Many entries referenced someone called simply R, often accompanied by heartfelt personal reflections that seemed out of place in otherwise professional notes. After 2 hours of sifting through materials that hinted at something bigger, but revealed nothing concrete, I locked up the unit, determined to return with more time and better lighting. Whatever story Uncle George had been researching, it had consumed years of his life. And now, apparently, it was my inheritance. Back at the ranch, I decided to explore the barn Uncle George had specifically mentioned in his letter. The massive wooden structure stood about 50 yards from the main house, weathered but solid, with a slight list to one side that somehow hadn't compromised its structural integrity. The heavy doors groaned in protest as I pushed them open. Dust motes danced in the beams of late afternoon sunlight that streamed through the high windows. The interior was larger than I expected, with horse stalls along one wall, a workshop area, and a loft overhead. Farm equipment sat covered in canvas tarps, and tools hung from hooks along the back wall, all bearing the patina of disuse. What caught my eye, however, was a pile of feed sacks in the far corner, stacked too neatly to be random storage. They didn't appear old or rotted like everything else in the barn. Instead, they looked deliberately placed, as if concealing something. My journalistic instincts, dormant but not dead, prickled to life. I crossed the barn floor, my boots kicking up decades of dust, and began moving the sacks one by one. They were surprisingly heavy, filled with what felt like actual grain. Whoever had placed them here had wanted the camouflage to withstand casual inspection. Beneath the last sack, partially embedded in the dirt floor, was what appeared to be a wooden chest, old and ornate, with brass fittings turned green with age. A heavy padlock secured the lid, but years of moisture had caused the wood around the hasp to rot. With minimal effort, I was able to pry it loose. The hinges protested with a sound like a wounded animal as I lifted the lid. Inside lay dozens of bundles of letters tied with faded ribbons, a collection of photographs in a metal box, and what appeared to be a leather-bound journal. My heart raced as I lifted the first bundle of letters. The paper was yellowed with age, the ink faded to a pale brown. They were addressed to "My dearest Rachel," in handwriting I immediately recognized as Uncle George's. I untied the ribbon with trembling fingers and began to read. April 16, 1978. My dearest Rachel, It's been 3 weeks since I last saw you, and each day stretches longer than the one before. Denver feels like exile, though the newspaper is everything I hope for professionally. Last night I dreamt you were beside me, your hair spread across the pillow in the moonlight. I woke reaching for you, finding only empty space. The story on the mining company corruption is gaining traction. My editor believes it could be significant enough to force regulatory action. I should feel satisfied, but all accomplishments seem hollow without you to share them. Has he noticed the letters? Are you still able to retrieve them from the post office without raising suspicion? I worry constantly about your safety. The offer stands. Shai, anytime, day or night, one call and I'll come for you. We could start fresh somewhere far from Montana, somewhere he would never find us. Until then, I remain forever yours, George. I read letter after letter, each one revealing another piece of a love story that had apparently spanned decades. George wrote about his work, his loneliness, and his constant fear for Rachel's safety. Her replies, for the chest contained those as well, spoke of stolen moments of happiness, of dreams deferred, and increasingly of fear. October 3rd, 1991. My beloved George. I write this with a trembling hand, not from passion this time, but from fear. Victor's rage grows worse. Yesterday, he found me looking at the photo of us at Lake Harmony. I managed to convince him you were just a colleague from a story he worked on years ago, but I don't think he believed me. The bruises on my wrist will fade, but my fear won't. The new sheriff is one of Victor's hunting friends. There's no one left in town I can trust. Sometimes I think everyone in Pinewood Valley knows and simply looks away. After all, Victor is a respected businessman, and I'm just his unstable wife. I've been putting aside small amounts of money from the household account. By spring, I might have enough to leave. Could you still find space in your life for a middle-aged woman with too much baggage and too many scars, with desperate hope, Rachel? The final letter in the collection made my blood run cold. Dated October 8th, 1993. It was written in a hasty, almost frantic scrawl. George, I can't wait until spring. Things have escalated beyond what I can endure. Victor found the money I'd been saving. The things he said, the threats he made, I won't put them on paper. I'm leaving Friday night. He'll be at the monthly Chamber of Commerce dinner in Billings. I'll take only what I can carry. Can you meet me at our spot by the creek at midnight? I'm terrified, but the thought of seeing you gives me courage. If something happens to me, know that loving you was the truest part of my life. Forever yours, Rachel. At the bottom of the chest, beneath all the correspondence, I found a newspaper clipping from the Pinewood Valley Gazette dated October 16, 1993. The headline read, "Local Woman Dies in Barn Fire." The woman's name was Rachel Blackwood, and according to the article, she had died when her husband's barn caught fire during the night. The cause was listed as accidental, probable electrical fault. I sat back on my heels, the clipping trembling in my hands. According to the article, Rachel had died on Friday, October 15, 1993, exactly 1 week after she'd written about leaving her husband. The timing couldn't be coincidental. Mixed with the letters were photographs spanning decades. George and a woman I now knew was Rachel Blackwood. The early photos showed them young and joyful, stealing moments together at county fairs, picnics, and secluded spots around the county. As the years progressed, I watched Rachel change through the lens of George's camera. Her smile became rare, then disappeared entirely. In the later photos, she wore long sleeves even in what appeared to be summer settings, and her eyes held a haunted quality that spoke of unspeakable fear. The final photograph was the most disturbing. Rachel with a black eye and split lip, looking directly at the camera with a mixture of desperation and determination. On the back, in Uncle George's handwriting, were the words, "The last time I saw her alive, October 8, 1993. I couldn't sleep that night. The letters and photographs lay spread across Uncle George's kitchen table as I paced the floor trying to make sense of what I'd discovered. Rachel Blackwood had died in a barn fire, but the timing was too convenient. Her last letter to George, dated just a week before her death, spoke of finally finding the courage to leave her husband. What had happened on that October night in 1993? Had Victor Blackwood somehow discovered his wife's plans to leave? Had Uncle George been there, and most importantly, why had he kept this evidence hidden for 30 years only to pass it to me now? The journal from the chest provided some answers, though far from complete ones. It began in late 1993, shortly after Rachel's death, and documented George's increasingly obsessive investigation into what he believed was murder disguised as an accident. October 30th, 1993. The sheriff won't listen, claims the fire investigation was thorough. But why was Rachel in the barn at midnight? Blackwood says she went to check on a sick calf, but they haven't had livestock in 3 years, and the electrical fault conveniently destroyed all evidence. Too neat, too clean. He knows I know. Saw him watching me at the funeral. That smug, satisfied look. Had to restrain myself from attacking him there in the cemetery. As the journal entries continued, George's writing became more paranoid, more desperate. December 12, 93, V died today. Heart attack. Convenient timing. Was he silenced? What did he know? Rachel's been gone 2 months. The trail grows colder. Blackwood walks around town like nothing happened. Respected businessman, grieving widower. I see the truth in his eyes when our paths cross. The knowledge, the triumph. I'll find proof if it's the last thing I do. The next morning, I drove back into town to visit the local library. If I was going to understand what had happened to Rachel Blackwood and what Uncle George had spent decades investigating, I needed historical context and local knowledge. The Pinewood Valley Public Library was housed in a charming brick building that had probably been constructed in the early 1900s. Inside the space was surprisingly modern and well-maintained, with computer stations, comfortable reading areas, and well-stocked shelves. The librarian, a petite Asian woman in her 60s with shrewd, intelligent eyes, looked up as I approached the reference desk. "Good morning," I said, offering my most disarming smile. "I'm Nathan Reed, George Reed's nephew. I've recently inherited his ranch, and I'm trying to learn more about the area's history." "With Eleanor Chenbars," she replied, adjusting her glasses as she studied me. "I knew your uncle well. He was a frequent patron, particularly of our newspaper archives." She paused, seemingly weighing her next words carefully. "What specific aspect of local history interests you, Mr. Reed?" "I'm interested in events from the early 1990s, particularly around 1993. I found some old newspaper clippings at the ranch, and I'm curious about the context." Something flickered across her features. Recognition, perhaps, or concern. "Our microfiche collection goes back to the 1950s. The computer terminal in the corner is set up for browsing the archives. I can show you how to use it if you'd like." As she guided me through the search interface, Mrs. Chen maintained a professional demeanor, but I sensed an underlying tension in her movements. "Your uncle spent many hours at this very terminal," she said quietly. "He was thorough in his research." "Did he ever discuss what he was researching?" "Librarians respect patron confidentiality, Mr. Reed." Her tone was gentle but firm. After a moment's hesitation, she added, "Though I will say he was particularly interested in local obituaries and property records from the early 90s. For the next several hours, I immersed myself in the digital archives of the Pinewood Valley Gazette. I started with Rachel Blackwood's obituary, which was brief and uninformative, mentioning only that she was survived by her husband Victor and a sister who lived out of state. The article about the fire provided few additional details beyond what I'd already read in the clipping from the chest. More interesting was Victor Blackwood's obituary from November 1993, just a month after Rachel's death. According to the article, the prominent local businessman had suffered a fatal heart attack at home. He was described as a pillar of the community who had been devastated by his wife's recent tragic death. The piece mentioned his successful construction company, his leadership in the Chamber of Commerce, and his close friendships with local officials, including then-Sheriff Robert Harrison. I expanded my search looking for any news items involving Blackwood Harrison or any of the other names that had appeared repeatedly in Uncle George's notes. A pattern began to emerge, a network of businessmen and local officials who seemed interconnected through various civic organizations, property deals, and development projects. Nothing overtly suspicious, but the same names appeared again and again, forming what looked like a power structure that had controlled Pinewood Valley for decades. As I continued digging, I noticed something else. Between 1973 and 1998, 6 women from the surrounding county had been reported missing. In each case, the investigations appeared cursory at best, with conclusions ranging from likely left town voluntarily to insufficient evidence of foul play. None of the cases had been solved. I was so engrossed in my research that I didn't notice the man watching me until Mrs. Chen approached my terminal with a cup of tea. Thought you might need this, she said, placing us a cup beside me. As she leaned in, she whispered, "The man by the history section has been watching you for the past hour. Gray hair scar on his left cheek. He asked about you earlier." I resisted the urge to turn and look. "Thank you." "Bye," I said, both for the tea and the warning. "If you need to use the back exit, let me know," she added in a normal tone before walking away. I continued my research for another 20 minutes, using the reflection in the computer screen to observe the man who was indeed watching me with undisguised interest. He was in his 60s, tall and fit for his age, with the ramrod posture that suggested military or law enforcement background. The scar on his cheek was thin but prominent, running from his left ear almost to his mouth. I finished my tea, logged out of the computer, and approached Mrs. Chen's desk. "Thank you for your help. Is there a restroom I could use before I leave?" She nodded, understanding immediately. "Through the reference section and to the left. There's an emergency exit just past it that leads to the alley behind the building." I thanked her and moved through the stacks, taking a deliberately meandering path. As I passed the history section, I caught a glimpse of the man with the scar moving to intercept me near the main entrance. Following Mrs. Chen's directions, I found the restroom and the emergency exit beyond it. The door opened into a narrow alley behind the library. I hurried to the street, then circled around to the parking lot where my truck was parked, constantly checking to see if I was being followed. As I pulled out of the parking lot, I noticed a black SUV with tinted windows starting its engine. It maintained a discreet distance as I drove through town, turning when I turned, slowing when I slowed. Rather than leading whoever it was back to the ranch, I drove to the diner on Main Street, parking in a spot visible from the large front windows. The Pinewood Valley Diner looked like it had been transported directly from the 1950s, complete with chrome-edged tables, red vinyl booths, and a long counter with swivel stools. A bell jingled as I pushed open the door, and several patrons glanced up briefly before returning to their meals. I chose a booth with a clear view of both my truck and the entrance, then ordered coffee from a middle-aged waitress whose name tag identified her as Doris. When she returned with my coffee, I decided to test the waters. "I'm Nathan Reed, George Reed's nephew. Just moved into his place." Doris's expression remained neutral, but I noticed a slight stiffening in her posture. "Is that so? George was a regular here for breakfast. Always had the same thing. 2 eggs over easy, wheat toast, black coffee. Did he ever come in with anyone, friends maybe?" She shook her head. "George kept to himself mostly, especially in recent years." She glanced toward the door as the bell jingled again. "Looks like the sheriff's here. You want to see a menu, or are you just having coffee?" The man who entered was not the gray-haired individual from the library, but younger, perhaps 50, with the weathered complexion of someone who spent considerable time outdoors. He wore a sheriff's department uniform and carried himself with the easy confidence of authority. His eyes scanned the diner and locked on me immediately, as if he'd been told exactly who to look for. He approached my booth with an amiable smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "You must be Reed's nephew. Word travels fast in small towns. I'm Sheriff Dave Davis." He extended his hand, which I shook briefly. "Mind if I join you?" Without waiting for an invitation, he slid into the booth across from me. "Sorry about your uncle. George was an interesting character. I'm just getting to know him posthumously," I replied, studying the sheriff's face for any reaction. "Finding all sorts of fascinating things at the ranch." Something flickered in Davis's eyes. Concern, perhaps, or calculation. "Oh, like what?" "Old journalism notes, mostly. My uncle kept meticulous records." "That he did." Davis signaled to Doris for coffee. "Any particular subject catch your interest?" The question was casual, but I sensed the tension beneath it. "I'm still sorting through everything." Seems like he was researching local history. "Lots of names I don't recognize yet." Davis nodded slowly. George had quite an imagination. Got fixated on certain theories in his later years. Occupational hazard for investigative types, I suppose. See conspiracies where there's just small-town politics. He stirred cream into his coffee. "How long you planning to stay in Pinewood Valley?" "Hard to say. I've got time on my hands and a lot to sort through at the ranch." "Well, if you need anything, the department's here to help." He produced a business card and slid it across the table. "My personal cell's on the back. Any problems, day or night, you call." The offer sounded like courtesy but felt like surveillance. I appreciate that, Sheriff. Actually, there is something you might help me with. I came across a news article about a woman named Rachel Blackwood who died in a fire back in '93. Seems like my uncle knew her. Was that before your time on the force? Davis's expression remained neutral, but his knuckles whitened around his coffee cup. Before my time as sheriff, yes, but I was a deputy then. Tragic accident. Electrical fire in the barn. She was trapped inside. Any idea why she'd be in a barn at midnight? The sheriff's gaze hardened slightly. Reports said she was checking on livestock. Not uncommon for ranch wives. Even though the Blackwoods hadn't kept livestock for years, Davis set down his cup with deliberate care. That was 30 years ago, Mr. Reed. Details get fuzzy. The investigation ruled it an accident, and that's what it was. He stood dropping a few dollars on the table for his coffee. Word of advice. Pinewood Valley is a peaceful town. We like it that way. Your uncle spent decades chasing shadows and stirring up old stories better left buried. Didn't do him any good, and it won't do you any good either. The threat was thinly veiled but unmistakable. Just trying to understand my uncle better, I said mildly. No offense intended. None taken. Davis adjusted his belt. Enjoy your stay in Pinewood Valley, Mr. Reed, however long it lasts. After he left, I sat nursing my coffee, mentally reviewing what I'd learned. Uncle George had spent decades investigating Rachel Blackwood's death, convinced it was murder rather than an accident. He'd accumulated evidence and research, but had never gone public with his findings. The local power structure, from the sheriff to the librarian, reacted with tension to even casual inquiries about the past. And now someone was watching me, tracking my movements through town. What had Uncle George discovered that was worth killing for 30 years ago? And why pass the investigation to me now after his death? As I paid my check and headed for the door, Doris intercepted me, pressing a folded napkin into my hand. Your uncle was a good man, she whispered. Don't trust anyone in this town. Outside in my truck, I unfolded the napkin to find a phone number in a single sentence. Call after midnight. Pay phone only. I spent the afternoon reviewing more of George's materials from the storage unit, focusing on his notes about the Blackwood case. The picture that emerged was disturbing. According to George's investigation, Victor Blackwood had been physically abusing his wife for years. When she finally planned to leave him somehow, he discovered her intentions and arranged her death to look like an accident. The barn fire had destroyed any evidence that might have suggested foul play. More disturbing were George's notes suggesting Blackwood hadn't acted alone. References to the network appeared repeatedly, along with names of local officials and businessmen George suspected were complicit either in Rachel's death or the subsequent cover-up. By evening, I was convinced of two things: Rachel Blackwood had been murdered, and her killers or their associates were still in positions of power in Pinewood Valley. The question remained, what could I do about it 30 years later? As midnight approached, I drove into town looking for a payphone, an increasingly rare sight in the age of cell phones. I finally found one outside a closed gas station on the edge of town. At 12:15 a.m., I dialed the number Doris had given me. She answered on the first ring. Reed, this is Doris. I don't have much time. Meet me at the old railroad bridge in 20 minutes. Come alone and make sure you're not followed. The line went dead before I could respond. The abandoned railroad bridge spanned a shallow creek about 2 miles outside town. It had been out of service for decades, the tracks long since removed, leaving only a weathered wooden trestle. I parked my truck on a dirt access road and walked the remaining quarter-mile, using only the moonlight to guide me. Doris was already there, a nervous silhouette against the night sky. She startled at my approach, relaxing slightly when she recognized me. You weren't followed, she asked, eyes darting past me into the darkness. I don't think so. Took a circuitous route, checked my mirrors constantly. She nodded, still tense. I worked with your uncle, not officially, but I helped him gather information. Being a waitress, you hear things people don't think you're listening to. What kind of information? Names, dates, meetings. She pulled a pack of cigarettes from her pocket, lit one with shaking hands. George was right about everything. Rachel Blackwood's death, the cover-up, all of it. There's a group of men who've run this town for decades. They protect each other, bury each other's secrets. Why are you telling me this now? Because George trusted you, and because I'm tired of carrying this alone. She inhaled deeply, the cigarette's ember glowing bright in the darkness. George was getting close to proving everything. He'd been documenting the network for years, not just Rachel's murder, but other women who disappeared, financial crimes, corruption. About 6 months ago, he told me he finally had enough evidence to go to the state authorities. And then he died of a heart attack, I said slowly. Doris's laugh was bitter. Convenient, wasn't it? Just like Victor Blackwood's heart attack after Rachel died. Just like Judge Peterson's stroke right after he started asking questions about county land deals. Are you saying George was murdered? I'm saying people who threaten the network tend to die from natural causes. And now you're digging into the same territory. She dropped her cigarette, grinding it under her heel. George left something for you, didn't he? Something important that he couldn't keep at the ranch. I hesitated, unsure how much to trust her. Why didn't George go public with what he knew? He was a journalist. He had connections. He tried early on. No one would touch the story. Too circumstantial, they said. No hard evidence. Then he realized how far the network's influence reached. Newspaper editors, state officials, even federal contacts. He decided to build an airtight case before going public. She glanced nervously over her shoulder. Look, I've risked enough being seen with you. George trusted you to finish what he started. Be careful who you talk to in town. The man with the scar, James Kirby. He's Harrison's right-hand man, ex-military, dangerous. Harrison, the former sheriff. Robert Harrison still pulls the strings around here, even in retirement. He and Blackwood were founding members of the network. She pressed a small flash drive into my hand. This has names, dates, connections, everything George shared with me. I don't want any more deaths on my conscience. Before I could ask another question, the crack of a branch breaking echoed from the woods behind us. Doris's eyes widened in terror. Go now, she hissed, pushing me toward the path. Different routes. Don't contact me again. I hesitated for just a moment before melting into the shadows, moving as quietly as possible back toward my truck. Behind me, I heard nothing but the wind in the trees and the distant call of a night bird. Whether someone had actually been watching us or it was just wildlife in the woods, I couldn't tell. But Doris's fear had been real and palpable. Back at the ranch, I examined the flash drive's contents. A meticulous record of Pinewood Valley's hidden power structure with Robert Harrison at its center. The former sheriff, now in his 70s, had orchestrated decades of corruption, intimidation, and occasionally murder. According to George's notes, Harrison had helped Victor Blackwood cover up Rachel's murder, then arranged Blackwood's subsequent heart attack to silence a potential weak link. What had begun as a simple cover-up for a domestic murder had revealed a deeper, more insidious conspiracy, one that had claimed multiple victims over decades and continued to hold Pinewood Valley in its grip. As I sat at Uncle George's kitchen table in the early hours of the morning, surrounded by evidence of corruption and murder, I realized I was at a crossroads. I could pack up, return to Denver, and forget everything I'd learned, the safer option by far. Or I could do what Uncle George had apparently expected of me, use my journalistic skills to expose the truth and bring justice to Rachel Blackwood and the network's other victims. The sound of a vehicle approaching the ranch broke through my thoughts. Headlights swept across the kitchen windows as a car pulled up outside. I quickly gathered the most incriminating documents and flash drive, hiding them in a vent behind the refrigerator that I'd discovered earlier. One of Uncle George's many hiding places throughout the house. A sharp knock at the door was followed by Sheriff Davis's voice. Reed, open up. Sheriff's Department. I checked my watch, 3:17 a.m. Not a social call. I opened the door to find Davis and the scarred man from the library, Kirby, according to Doris, standing on my porch. Both men looked grim. Nathan Reed, Davis said formally, I need you to come down to the station to answer some questions. At 3 in the morning, what about? We've had a report of suspicious activity at the old railroad bridge. Witness saw your truck in the area. My mind raced. Had they seen me with Doris? Was she safe? I couldn't sleep. Went for a drive. That's not a crime, Sheriff. Davis's expression hardened. No, but trespassing on railroad property is. And we have other concerns to discuss. Please come with us, sir. It wasn't a request. Behind Davis, Kirby rested his hand on what was clearly a holstered weapon beneath his jacket. Let me get my coat, I said, mind racing for options. Now, Mr. Reed, Davis insisted, stepping forward to prevent me from closing the door. I had no choice but to go with them as they escorted me to the sheriff's SUV. I noticed Kirby scanning the ranch house with calculating eyes. Whatever they wanted, it wasn't really about trespassing on railroad property. They were looking for something or someone. The pieces were falling into place with horrible clarity. Uncle George hadn't just documented crimes from 30 years ago. He'd uncovered an ongoing criminal conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of local government. A conspiracy that had killed before and would kill again to protect its secrets. And now I was in their crosshairs, being driven into the darkness by men who answered to Robert Harrison, the man at the center of it all. The sheriff's station was eerily quiet at that hour, with only a sleepy dispatcher at the front desk and a single deputy manning the cells. Davis led me to an interrogation room, a stark space with a metal table, 3 chairs, and a large mirror that undoubtedly concealed an observation area. Kirby remained outside, his scarred face the last thing I saw before the door closed. "Have a seat, Mr. Reed," Davis said, gesturing to a chair that faced the mirror. I sat, keeping my expression neutral, despite the anxiety building in my chest. "I'd like to know what this is really about, Sheriff. We both know it's not about trespassing." Davis smiled thinly as he took the seat across from me. "Smart man, like your uncle." He placed a manila folder on the table between us, but didn't open it. "Who were you meeting at the railroad bridge tonight?" "I told you, I went for a drive, couldn't sleep." "And you chose an abandoned railroad bridge miles from town as your destination. At midnight." He leaned forward. "We know you met someone. We know you've been asking questions about Rachel Blackwood's death and digging through old newspaper archives. What we don't know is why a Denver journalist suddenly cares about a 30-year-old accident in a town he's never visited before." Just trying to understand my uncle better. I repeated my earlier explanation. He left me everything. Seems like I should know who he was. Davis studied me, his expression unreadable. George Reed was a troubled man who couldn't let go of the past. He made accusations against respected members of this community based on nothing but conjecture and personal grievance. He tapped the folder. "Do you know what's in here, Nathan? It's your uncle's psychiatric evaluation from 2015. Diagnosed with paranoid personality disorder, delusions, obsessive behavior. Is that the legacy you want to continue?" The revelation hit me like a physical blow. Could it be true? Had Uncle George's investigation been nothing but the product of a disordered mind? I thought of the meticulous notes, the carefully preserved evidence, the logical connections between events and people. It hadn't seemed delusional. "I'd like to see that evaluation," I said carefully. Davis shook his head. "Medical records. Confidential. But I'm telling you this as a courtesy to help you understand the situation you are walking into. George made enemies here with his wild accusations. Don't make the same mistake." "Am I under arrest, Sheriff?" "No, consider this a friendly warning. Deputy Kirby will drive you back to the ranch." "I'd prefer to call a cab." "At this hour in Pinewood Valley," Davis laughed. "Not likely. Don't worry. Kirby knows the way." The ride back to the ranch was tense and silent. Kirby drove with mechanical precision, his scarred face illuminated occasionally by passing streetlights. As we turned onto the dirt road leading to the ranch, he finally spoke, his voice a gravelly whisper. Reed was getting close. Too close. That's why they silenced him. I kept my expression neutral, unsure if this was some kind of trap. "What are you talking about? Your uncle, his heart attack? Not natural. Same as Blackwood, same as Judge Peterson." "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you'll be next if you don't back off." He pulled up to the ranch house and shifted into park, but didn't unlock the doors. "Davis is Harrison's man. Whole department is. If you keep digging, they'll find a way to silence you too. Heart attack, accident, suicide. They're good at making murder look natural." "Why should I believe you?" "You work for them." Kirby's laugh was bitter. "I follow orders. Doesn't mean I don't see what's happening. 20 years in special forces taught me to recognize evil when I see it. What's happening in Pinewood Valley is evil." "Then help me stop it," I challenged. He shook his head. "I've got family, vulnerabilities. Can't stick my neck out." He reached into his jacket and withdrew a small key. "But I won't stop someone who can. Storage Unit 23, same facility as your uncle's. Combination to the lock is 10-15-93. I took the key, recognizing the numbers immediately. The date of Rachel's final letter to George. "What's in there?" "Insurance. Your uncle gave it to me 6 months ago. Said if anything happened to him, I should make sure you got it. Kirby's eyes met mine briefly. I'm sorry about tonight. Had to maintain appearances. From now on, we've never spoken. He looked pointedly at the door and I took the hint, exiting the vehicle quickly. As soon as I was clear, he sped away, leaving me standing in the pre-dawn darkness with more questions than answers and a key that might unlock them. I waited until Kirby's taillights disappeared before entering the house. My mind raced with contradictory information. Davis claimed George had been mentally ill, suffering from paranoid delusions. Yet Kirby, who seemingly worked for the network, had just confirmed George's suspicions and provided a key to what might be crucial evidence. The house felt different now, vulnerable, exposed. I checked windows and doors, drawing curtains and turning off lights. Sleep was out of the question. Instead, I returned to George's materials, particularly his journal entries from the last year of his life. The most recent entries painted a picture of a man who knew he was in danger but remained determined to expose the truth. May 15, 2023, made contact with agent at State Bureau, cautiously optimistic. Says with enough evidence they could reopen several cases. Arranging secure communication channel. Need to compile everything into one comprehensive file. The women deserve justice. Rachel deserves justice. June 8, 2023. Kay approached me today. Unexpected ally. Says he's seen enough, wants out. Gave him package to hold. Insurance in case something happens. Told him about Nathan. Hope I'm not making a mistake trusting him. August 30, 2023. Someone broke into the storage unit last night. Nothing taken. They didn't find what they were looking for. Need to be more careful. Moving key materials to safer location. If anything happens to me, all roads lead to H. Remember that. The final entry, dated just 3 days before his death, was particularly chilling. September 12th, meeting with Rai tomorrow to hand over everything. After 30 years, justice is finally within reach. If you're reading this, Nathan and I didn't make it follow the map. Uncover what they buried. The truth is literally in the ground. Follow the map. I hadn't found any map among George's papers. I returned to the barn just as dawn was breaking, the early morning light, casting long shadows across the weathered floorboards. The wooden chest was where I'd left it, partially covered by feed sacks. I searched through it again more thoroughly this time, examining each bundle of letters, each photograph. In the metal box that had contained the photographs, I discovered a false bottom. Beneath it lay a folded piece of paper, a hand-drawn map of what appeared to be the Blackwood property, with several areas marked with X's. One location near where the barn had stood was circled multiple times in red ink. I studied the map, trying to orient myself. Without seeing the property in person, it was difficult to determine exactly what George had marked, but the message was clear. He believed evidence was buried on the Blackwood land. Evidence that could prove Rachel's death wasn't an accident. I needed to visit Storage Unit 23 first to see what insurance George had entrusted to Kirby, but that would have to wait until later. The facility wouldn't open until 9:00 a.m., and after my encounter with Davis and Kirby, I needed to be more cautious about my movements in town. I was making coffee in the kitchen when a vehicle approached the ranch. Not the aggressive arrival of the sheriff's SUV, but the measured pace of someone who wasn't in a hurry. Through the window, I watched a dusty blue Jeep park next to my truck. A woman emerged, early 30s, Hispanic with dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. She wore jeans, boots, and a khaki shirt that I recognized as a sheriff's department uniform, though without the typical duty belt and sidearm. She approached the house with confident strides, scanning the property with the practiced eye of law enforcement. I met her at the door before she could knock. "Nathan Reed," she asked, producing a badge. "Deputy Lisa Ortega, Cedar Creek Sheriff's Department." Another friendly warning from Sheriff Davis? "Actually, no. Sheriff doesn't know I'm here." She glanced over her shoulder. "May I come in?" "It's not safe to talk outside." I hesitated, then stepped aside. If the network wanted me dead, they wouldn't send a female deputy alone in broad daylight. Inside, Ortega declined my offer of coffee and got straight to the point. "I worked with your uncle. Not officially. He didn't trust the department, but we shared information about Rachel Blackwood and others. 6 women who disappeared between 1973 and 1998, all with connections to domestic violence situations, and all with cases that were suspiciously mishandled by local authorities. She produced a thin file folder from her jacket. This is what I've been able to compile without raising flags. It's not much, but it might help you understand what George was investigating. I took the folder, still wary. Why should I trust you? Because George did. Because I became a cop to help victims, not cover for abusers. Because I've spent 5 years investigating these cases on my own time, facing roadblocks at every turn. Her dark eyes flashed with conviction. And because Davis and Harrison would have me fired, or worse, if they knew I was here. I studied her for a long moment, weighing the risks. Finally, I decided to take a chance. I found a map, I said, retrieving it from the kitchen table. George's last journal entry mentioned following it to find something buried on the Blackwood property. Ortega examined the map intently. I know this area. The Blackwood land was sold to developers after Victor died, but construction never started. It's been sitting empty for 30 years. She pointed to the location George had circled in red. This is where the barn stood before the fire. Whatever George thought was buried there, it would have been directly under where Rachel died. The implications were chilling. Had Rachel discovered something buried in the barn? Had that discovery led to her murder? I need to see that property, I said. Ortega nodded slowly. I can take you, but we need to be careful. If anyone from the department spots us there, we'll both be in danger. She handed me back the map. Meet me at the end of Ridge Road at noon. It's a back way onto the property, less visible from the main road. Before she left, I asked, do you know anything about George being diagnosed with paranoid personality disorder? Davis showed me a file. Ortega's expression hardened. That's their playbook. Discredit anyone who gets too close to the truth. Make them seem unstable, unreliable. They tried the same thing with one of the missing women before she disappeared. Had the town doctor diagnose her with hysteria when she reported her husband's abuse. So it's not true about George's mental health. George was one of the most clear-headed, methodical people I've ever met. Paranoid number cautious because he knew dangerous people were watching him. Absolutely. She moved toward the door. Noon Ridge Road. Come alone and make sure you are not followed. After Ortega left, I spent the morning reviewing the files she'd provided. The 6 missing women shared disturbing similarities. All had been in relationships with prominent local men. All had shown signs of abuse, and all had reportedly planned to leave shortly before disappearing. In each case, the investigations had been cursory at best, with conclusions ranging from likely left town voluntarily to insufficient evidence of foul play. Most disturbing was the fact that Robert Harrison had been involved in every investigation, either as sheriff or as a senior deputy. His signature appeared on reports dismissing evidence, closing cases prematurely, or ruling deaths as accidents despite suspicious circumstances. At 10:30, I drove into town to visit Storage Unit 23. I took a circuitous route, frequently checking my mirrors for signs of surveillance. The elderly attendant barely looked up as I signed in, and I made my way to the unit without encountering anyone else. The padlock opened with the combination Kirby had provided, 10-1593, the date of Rachel's death. Inside was a single metal lockbox, military grade, with a combination dial rather than a key. Using the same numbers, I opened it to find a USB drive, a small notebook, and a microcassette recorder with several tapes. I pocketed all 3 items, relocked the storage unit, and left the facility as inconspicuously as I'd arrived. Rather than return to the ranch and risk being followed to my meeting with Ortega, I drove to a small coffee shop on the outskirts of Town 1 with free Wi-Fi and corner tables that offered privacy. The USB drive contained video files, interviews George had conducted with former Pinewood Valley residents who had known the missing women. Each person spoke of harassment, intimidation, or threats that had forced them to remain silent about what they'd witnessed. One particularly chilling interview featured an elderly man who claimed to have seen Victor Blackwood and Robert Harrison entering the Blackwood barn with shovels late at night, weeks before the fire that killed Rachel. The notebook contained names, dates, and locations, a meticulous record of the network's membership and activities spanning decades. The names included past and present town officials, business leaders, and law enforcement officers. A who's who of Pinewood Valley's power structure. The microcassette tapes proved most disturbing of all. They contained recordings of conversations between network members discussing everything from covering up domestic violence to silencing witnesses. One tape labeled simply H&B 10-14-93 captured a conversation between Harrison and Blackwood the night before Rachel died. "She's leaving tomorrow night, planning to meet him at midnight." Blackwood's voice slurred with what sounded like alcohol. "You're sure?" Harrison, calm and methodical. "Found the letter. She's been saving money planning this for months. Thinks she can just walk away after everything I've done for her. We'll handle it, same as before, but Victor, this is the last time I clean up your messes. Understand? After tomorrow, you need to get your house in order. What about Reed? He'll know. He'll talk. Let me worry about the journalist. You just make sure everything's ready at the barn tonight." The recording ended there, but its implications were clear. Harrison and Blackwood had planned Rachel's murder, and they'd been concerned about George even then. I checked my watch, 11:45. Time to meet Ortega. I copied all the files to my phone as backup, then packed everything away and drove to Ridge Road, parking my truck behind a stand of trees where it wouldn't be visible from the main road. Ortega was already waiting in her Jeep. She nodded tersely as I approached, then gestured for me to get in. "Anyone follow you?" "Not that I noticed. I took precautions." She put the Jeep in gear, driving slowly down a rutted dirt track that wound through dense woods. "This access road hasn't been used much since the Blackwood place was abandoned. It'll take us right to the back of the property." As we drove, I told her about the evidence I'd found in Storage Unit 23, particularly the recorded conversation between Harrison and Blackwood the night before Rachel died. "That's the smoking gun George was looking for," she said, her knuckles whitening on the steering wheel. "Actual proof of premeditation." "It's 30 years old," I pointed out. "Would it still be admissible in court?" "There's no statute of limitations on murder. With this recording and whatever's buried on the property, we might finally have enough to go to the state authorities." The track eventually opened onto an overgrown field. In the distance, I could make out the crumbling foundation of what had once been a house. Beside it, nothing remained of the barn except a blackened patch of earth where nothing grew even 30 years later. Ortega parked the Jeep in a copse of trees, concealing it from view. "We'll approach on foot from here. Less chance of being spotted." We walked in silence across the field, alert for any sign of other visitors. The Blackwood property had an eerie, abandoned quality, nature reclaiming what humans had once built, but seemingly reluctant to fully embrace the sight of such tragedy. The house foundation was little more than crumbling concrete now, with saplings and weeds growing through cracks in what had once been a basement. The barn site was more disturbing, a perfect rectangle of blackened earth where nothing grew. Not even weeds or moss. The ground looked diseased, as if the fire that had consumed Rachel Blackwood had somehow poisoned the soil itself. "George's map," I said, unfolding it carefully. "The location he marked is right here in the center of where the barn stood." Ortega surveyed the area with professional attention. "We'll need shovels." She returned minutes later with 2 shovels, work gloves, and a canvas tarp. "We don't know what we're looking for, so we need to be methodical. Start in the center, work outward in a grid pattern." The soil was hard and compacted, making digging difficult. We worked in silence, each lost in thoughts about what we might uncover. After nearly an hour of exhausting labor, my shovel struck something solid about 4 feet down. "I've got something," I called to Ortega, who was working a few feet away. Together, we carefully cleared soil away from what appeared to be a metal box roughly 2 feet square. It was heavily corroded but still intact, sealed with a padlock that had fused shut with rust and time. "We need to get this out without damaging whatever's inside," Ortega said, examining the box. "The contents could be fragile after all this time." We widened the hole, then carefully lifted the box onto the tarp Ortega had spread nearby. Using the shovel's edge, I managed to break the rusted padlock after several attempts. The lid resisted, then yielded with a groan of protesting metal. Inside, protected by layers of plastic sheeting, was a collection of items that made my blood run cold. A woman's blood-stained clothing, a hammer with dark stains on its head, and several Polaroid photographs showing what appeared to be Rachel Blackwood's lifeless body positioned in the barn as if she had been overcome by smoke. "They staged the scene," Ortega whispered, her professional composure cracking slightly. "Killed her first, then set the fire to cover it up." Also in the box was a small notebook, its pages yellow with age but still legible. It contained what appeared to be a ledger of payments, names and dates, a record of the network's activities. This is bigger than just Rachel's murder, I said, flipping through the pages. This documents decades of corruption, blackmail payoffs. And it has Victor Blackwood's handwriting all over it, Ortega added, peering over my shoulder. This is what Rachel must have found. Evidence of her husband's crimes. That's why they killed her. As we carefully documented and repacked the box's contents, a sound from the direction of the road caught our attention. The unmistakable crunch of tires on gravel. Someone's coming, Ortega whispered, immediately alert. We need to move now. We quickly gathered the box and our tools, retreating toward the trees where we'd left the Jeep. Through a gap in the foliage, I caught sight of a black SUV approaching the property, the same vehicle Davis had used to bring me to the station. Davis, I whispered to Ortega. How did he know we were here? Her expression darkened. Someone must have followed one of us, or... She hesitated, a new suspicion dawning. Or my movements are being monitored. The department tracks our vehicle's Jeep. We reached the Jeep and quickly stowed our findings in the back, covering them with a tarp. Ortega started the engine but kept the lights off, navigating slowly through the trees toward the back access road. If we can reach the main highway, we have a chance, she said, her voice tense but controlled. I have contacts at the State Bureau. We get this evidence to them, it's over for Harrison and his network. We had almost reached the access road when headlights swept across the trees ahead of us. A vehicle was approaching from that direction as well. They've cut us off, Ortega muttered, abruptly changing direction. Hang on. She veered off the track, driving directly into the woods branches, scraping against the Jeep's sides as we bounced over uneven terrain. Behind us, I could hear engines revving as our pursuers realized we were escaping. There's an old logging road about a quarter-mile ahead, Ortega explained, navigating by memory through the darkening forest. If we can reach it, it'll take us to the highway bypass. They'll have trouble following with their larger vehicles. My phone vibrated in my pocket. The screen displayed a text message from an unknown number. Stop now, last warning. As if on cue, a bullet shattered the Jeep's rear window, sending glass fragments spraying across the back seat. Get down, Ortega shouted, accelerating, despite the treacherous terrain. More shots followed, most going wide, but one pinged off the metal frame inches from my head. Ortega drove with remarkable skill, using the trees as cover, while maintaining enough speed to stay ahead of our pursuers. Finally, we broke through the forest onto a narrow dirt road, the logging track she'd mentioned. Ortega immediately turned right, accelerating hard on the more even surface. How far to the highway? I asked, glancing nervously behind us. 2 miles, maybe less. Her words were cut short by the sound of an engine roaring directly ahead of us. Headlights appeared around a bend in the road, bearing down on us at high speed. Ortega swore and jerked the wheel hard to the right, sending the Jeep crashing through the underbrush. For a moment it seemed we might make it. Then the front wheels caught in a drainage ditch, bringing us to a violent halt. The impact threw me against the dashboard despite my seatbelt, and I tasted blood where I'd bitten my lip. Run! Ortega shouted, already unbuckling her seatbelt. Grab the evidence and run. I'll hold them off. I reached into the back, seizing the metal box and the bag containing the USB drive and tapes. I'm not leaving you. You have to get to the highway flag, down a car called the State Police. She drew a small pistol from an ankle holster I hadn't noticed before. Go now. The decision was made for us as 2 vehicles converged on our position, headlights illuminating the crashed Jeep like spotlights on a stage. Doors opened and figures emerged. At least 5 men, their silhouettes unmistakably armed. Reed Ortega. We know you're in there. Davis's voice amplified by what sounded like a bullhorn. Come out with your hands up. This doesn't have to get messy. Ortega met my eyes in the dim light, her expression resolute. There's a culvert behind us. Leads toward the highway. Take the evidence and go. It's our only chance. What about you? I'll surrender, buy you time. They won't shoot a deputy in cold blood. Too many questions. But you, a trespasser resisting arrest. She left the implication hanging. Go finish what George started. Before I could protest further, she opened her door and stepped out, hands raised. Sheriff Davis, it's Ortega. Don't shoot. While Davis's attention was focused on Ortega, I slipped out the passenger side and into the darkness. The metal box clutched against my chest. Behind me, I heard Davis's angry voice. Where's Reed? Where's the evidence? I don't know what you're talking about, Ortega replied, her voice steady despite the danger. I was just showing Mr. Afam. Read some local landmarks. I didn't hear the rest as I slid down into the culvert Ortega had mentioned, a concrete drainage pipe large enough to crouch in, running roughly parallel to the logging road. Water soaked through my jeans as I half crawled, half stumbled through the darkness, guided only by the faint moonlight filtering through occasional drainage grates above. Behind me, I heard shouting, then the unmistakable sound of a single gunshot. I froze, heart pounding. Had they shot Ortega? The thought spurred me forward with renewed urgency. If they'd harmed her, I couldn't let her sacrifice be in vain. The culvert seemed endless, a claustrophobic tunnel of concrete and stagnant water. My knees were scraped raw, my clothes soaked, but I kept moving. The weight of the evidence and the responsibility it represented driving me forward. Finally, the pipe widened, opening into a larger drainage ditch beside what appeared to be the highway Ortega had been trying to reach. I crawled up the embankment, still clutching the metal box, and collapsed onto the grassy verge beside the road, gasping for breath. Traffic was sparse at this hour, but I could see headlights approaching in the distance. I staggered to my feet, prepared to flag down the next vehicle, then hesitated. What if it was one of Harrison's men? In a small town like Pinewood Valley, how could I know who to trust? I retreated to the tree line, watching as a pickup truck passed without noticing me. The next vehicle was a semi-truck moving too fast to stop safely. The third was a state police cruiser. For a moment, hope surged through me. Then I saw the cruiser's light bar activate its headlight, swinging in a U-turn to head back in my direction. Someone had spotted me, but was it help or another threat? I couldn't take the chance. I retreated deeper into the woods, paralleling the highway. My phone had no signal, either damaged in the crash or blocked by the dense forest canopy. I needed to find another way to contact authorities outside Pinewood Valley, someone beyond Harrison's influence. As I stumbled through the darkness, a new worry gnawed at me. The gunshot I'd heard, had Ortega been injured or worse? And if she had, how would I prove it wasn't an accident? Davis could claim she'd been shot while pursuing a trespasser, or that her gun had discharged during the crash. Without witnesses, it would be my word against the entire sheriff's department. The magnitude of what we were facing crashed down upon me. This wasn't just about solving a 30-year-old murder anymore. It was about exposing a criminal network that had infected every level of local government, a network that had already killed multiple times and wouldn't hesitate to kill again to protect itself. And now I was alone in the wilderness, miles from help, carrying evidence that powerful men would murder to suppress. As if to punctuate this realization, my phone vibrated once more. Despite the lack of signal for calls, a text message had somehow gotten through. We have Deputy Ortega, evidence for her life. Old Mill, midnight. Attached was a photo that made my blood freeze. Lisa Ortega, bloodied but conscious, tied to a chair in what appeared to be an abandoned industrial space. Behind her stood a figure in shadow, holding what was unmistakably a gun to her head. I checked the time, 10:43 p.m., just over an hour to decide, attempt to reach outside help, or walk into what was almost certainly a trap to save a woman who had risked everything to help me. In that moment, I thought of Uncle George, who had spent 30 years pursuing justice for Rachel Blackwood and other victims. I thought of Doris risking her safety to pass on information. I thought of Kirby making one small gesture of rebellion against the corruption he'd been part of. And I thought of Lisa Ortega, who had just sacrificed her freedom and perhaps her life to help a stranger expose the truth. I couldn't abandon her, but I also couldn't surrender the evidence, not when it represented the only hope for justice for so many victims. I needed a third option. The old mill mentioned in the text was familiar from my research, an abandoned paper mill that had closed in the 1980s, located about 3 miles north of town. It was remote, isolated, perfect for an exchange that no one was meant to walk away from. As I trudged through the woods toward the highway, hoping to orient myself toward town, a plan began to form in my mind. It was desperate, dangerous, and depended on variables I couldn't control. But it was the only chance Ortega and I had of surviving the night and exposing the truth. First, I needed to secure the evidence. I found a hollow tree about 50 yards from the highway and carefully placed the metal box inside, covering it with leaves and fallen branches. I memorized the location, noting landmarks I could use to find it again if I survived the night. The USB drive and micro-cassette tapes I kept with me tucked into an inner pocket of my jacket. If I couldn't make it back to retrieve the box, perhaps these digital records would find their way to someone who could use them. Next, I needed transportation. The highway was still my best option, despite the risk of being spotted. I made my way back to the road, staying within the tree line until I spotted a suitable vehicle, an older model pickup truck parked outside a small gas station about a quarter mile ahead. The station appeared to be closed for the night, but the truck's keys were visibly hanging from the ignition, the kind of carelessness possible only in rural areas where vehicle theft was rare. I felt a pang of guilt as I slipped into the driver's seat and started the engine. But Ortega's life depended on speed now. I'd find a way to return the truck later if I could. As I drove towards Pinewood Valley, I cycled through local radio stations until I found one broadcasting news. To my shock, the hourly update included a bulletin about an armed suspect who attacked a sheriff's deputy and fled into the woods near Highway 47. The report advised residents to stay indoors and contact authorities if they spotted a male in his 40s, approximately 6 feet tall with dark hair, considered armed and dangerous. Davis was moving quickly to control the narrative. By morning, I'd be the most wanted man in the county, with every law enforcement officer looking for me. My window for action was closing fast. I parked the borrowed truck about a half mile from the old mill, concealing it behind an abandoned storage shed. The mill loomed ahead, a massive decaying structure of brick and rusted metal silhouetted against the night sky like the skeleton of some prehistoric beast. Checking my phone, I saw it was 11:47 p.m., 13 minutes until the deadline. I circled the perimeter looking for surveillance or guards. The mill complex was extensive with multiple buildings in various states of collapse, but only the main processing facility showed signs of recent activity. Tire tracks in the mud, a padlock on the main entrance that looked newer than its surroundings. Through a broken window, I caught a glimpse of movement, figures walking purposefully through the cavernous interior. I counted at least 3 men, possibly more, in areas I couldn't see. They were armed, their weapons clearly visible, even in the dim light filtering through broken skylights. Among them, I recognized Davis and Kirby. The third man was older, with the bearing of someone accustomed to authority. Harrison, I presumed, though I'd never seen him in person. In the center of the space, tied to a chair, just as in the photo, was Lisa Ortega. Even from a distance, I could see blood on her face and an unnatural angle to her left arm that suggested it was broken. But she was alive, her head moving as she tracked the movements of her captors. I had no weapon, no backup, and no realistic chance of overpowering 3 armed men to rescue Ortega. But I did have one advantage: they didn't know what I knew. At precisely midnight, I stepped through the mill's main entrance, hands raised to show I was unarmed. The reaction was immediate. All 3 men turned, weapons raised. "That's far enough, Reed," Davis called. "Where's the evidence?" "Safe," I replied, keeping my voice steady despite the fear coursing through me. "As insurance, let Deputy Ortega go, and I'll tell you where to find it." The older man, Harrison, stepped forward, studying me with cold, calculating eyes. "You're in no position to negotiate, Mr. Reed. We have the deputy. We have this facility surrounded. And by morning, every law enforcement officer in 3 counties will be looking for you for assaulting an officer. And yet here I am walking into your trap voluntarily, because I have something you want very badly." "The evidence won't help you," Harrison said dismissively, "even if you manage to get it to the authorities who would believe the accusations of a fugitive against respected community leaders. The story's already written, Reed. You attacked Deputy Ortega while trespassing on private property. She was injured in the line of duty. Tragic, but it happens." I looked at Ortega, meeting her eyes across the space between us. Despite her injuries, her gaze remained defiant, unwavering. "That might work," I agreed, "except for one detail you have overlooked." I reached slowly into my jacket, telegraphing my movements to avoid getting shot. "I'm a journalist. We document everything." I withdrew my phone, holding it up so they could see the screen. "I've been broadcasting this entire conversation via a secure connection to colleagues in Denver. Every word, every threat recorded and transmitted in real time. If anything happens to Deputy Ortega or me, the recording, along with all the evidence we found today, goes directly to the FBI, the state police, and every major news outlet in the country." It was a desperate bluff. My phone had barely enough signal to send a text, let alone stream video. But in the dim light of the mill with distance between us, they couldn't see the screen clearly enough to know it wasn't actually broadcasting. Harrison's expression didn't change, but I saw uncertainty flicker in Davis's eyes. Even Kirby, standing slightly apart from the others, seemed to tense his gaze darting between me and his companions. "You're lying," Harrison said finally, but there was a note of hesitation in his voice. "Am I? You've been in power so long you've forgotten what real journalism looks like. George taught me well. Always have backup plans for your backup plans." I kept the phone steady as if it were actually recording. "Now here's what's going to happen. You're going to untie Deputy Ortega. We're going to walk out of here, and tomorrow we're going to have a very public conversation with the state authorities about Rachel Blackwood, Victor Blackwood, and 6 other women who disappeared on your watch." Harrison's face darkened with rage. "You have no idea who you're dealing with, boy. Men like me built this town, kept it safe, prosperous. You think anyone will thank you for tearing it all down, for exposing secrets better left buried? Safe for whom?" I challenged. "Not for Rachel Blackwood. Not for the other women your network silenced. Not for anyone who dared question your authority." For a long moment, no one moved. The standoff stretched taut as a wire about to snap. Then unexpectedly, Kirby stepped forward. "It's over, Bob," he said quietly to Harrison. "Reed's right. World's changed. Can't keep burying the past forever." Harrison turned on him, fury transforming his features. You're with him, not with anyone," Kirby replied, his scarred face impassive. "Just tired of the lies. Tired of what this town's become." The distraction was brief but crucial. Ortega, who had apparently been working on her restraints throughout our conversation, suddenly lunged forward, driving her shoulder into Davis's stomach despite her injured arm. The sheriff stumbled backward, his weapon discharging into the ceiling. In the chaos that followed, I rushed forward, tackling Harrison before he could bring his gun to bear. We crashed to the floor, his weapon skittering away across the concrete. Despite his age, he was surprisingly strong, his fingers closing around my throat with vice-like pressure. "Should have killed you the moment you arrived," he snarled, his face inches from mine. "Same as your uncle. Heart attack. So easy to arrange." The admission that George had indeed been murdered gave me a surge of desperate strength. I broke his grip and rolled away, gasping for breath. Nearby, Ortega had somehow managed to disarm Davis, despite her injuries, and now held him at gunpoint. Kirby stood apart, his own weapon lowered, making no move to intervene. "It's over, Harrison," I said, struggling to my feet. "You just confessed to murdering George Reed. And this time there were witnesses." Ortega added, her voice steady despite the pain evident on her face. Harrison laughed, a harsh, bitter sound devoid of humor. "Witnesses, a dirty cop and a disgraced journalist. Who's going to believe either of you?" "They'll believe this," said a new voice from the entrance. We all turned to see Eleanor Chen, the librarian, standing in the doorway with what appeared to be a small digital recorder in her hand. Beside her stood Doris from the diner and 2 men I didn't recognize. "We've been documenting Harrison's activities for years." Mrs. Chen continued, her voice steady despite the tension in the room. "Building on George's work, waiting for the right moment to expose everything." "The State Bureau is already on its way," added one of the men who wore the uniform of a state trooper. "Agent Phillips, Montana Department of Justice. We've had Pinewood Valley under surveillance for months based on information George Reed provided before his death." Harrison's face went slack with shock, then hardened into a mask of hatred. "You'll regret this," he spat. "All of you. This town needs men like me, always has." "No," I said quietly. "What this town needs is the truth. What it needs is justice for Rachel Blackwood and all the others who suffered under your protection. That's what George fought for. That's what we're going to deliver." As state troopers swarmed into the mill securing Harrison and Davis, I felt a weight lifting. The burden of secrets George had carried for 30 years, now finally brought into the light. But mixed with that relief was a sobering realization. The truth had come at a terrible cost: George's life, possibly Ortega's career, and the peaceful illusion that Pinewood Valley was just another quiet Montana town untouched by the darker currents of human nature. As paramedics tended to Ortega's injuries, she caught my eye across the room. "He would be proud," she said simply. "George, he always said you were the one who would finish what he started." I nodded, unable to speak past the lump in my throat. In just a few days, I discovered a legacy far more complex and demanding than a simple ranch in Montana. I'd inherited George's quest for justice, his determination to expose the truth no matter the cost. And somehow, against all odds, we'd succeeded where he had not. But as Ortega was loaded into an ambulance and Harrison and Davis were led away in handcuffs, I couldn't help wondering what other secrets remained buried in Pinewood Valley and what price we might yet pay for unearthing them. The dawn broke cold and gray over Pinewood Valley, bathing the town in a pale, uncertain light. 3 days had passed since the confrontation at the abandoned mill, and the quiet community was still reeling from the arrests of former Sheriff Harrison and current Sheriff Davis. State police cruisers patrolled the streets, their unfamiliar presence, a stark reminder that the power structure that had governed the town for decades had crumbled overnight. I sat in a private room at Pinewood Valley Memorial Hospital, watching Lisa Ortega sleep. The steady beep of monitors and the antiseptic smell of disinfectant filled the air. Her injuries had been severe: a broken arm, 3 cracked ribs, and a concussion from the beating she'd received at Harrison's hands. The doctors assured me she would recover fully, but the physical wounds were only part of the damage. When she'd regained consciousness the previous evening, her first words had been about the evidence. "The box," she'd whispered through cracked lips. "Did they find it?" "Yes," I'd assured her. "State police recovered it exactly where I hid it, along with everything else. The tape's the USB drive. It's all safe." She nodded once, then drifted back to sleep, her body demanding rest to heal. Now, as I watched the rise and fall of her chest, I couldn't help but marvel at her courage. She'd risked everything: her career, her safety, her life, to help a stranger pursue a truth buried for 30 years. It was a level of integrity I'd witnessed too rarely in my journalistic career. A soft knock at the door interrupted my thoughts. Agent Phillips from the Montana Department of Justice entered, his expression grave. He was a lean, weathered man in his 50s, with the focused intensity of someone who had spent decades pursuing difficult cases. "How is she?" he asked, nodding toward Ortega. "Stable. Doctors say she'll be moved out of intensive care tomorrow." He nodded relief, briefly softening his features. "Good. She's a brave woman." He gestured toward the hallway. "Got a minute to talk?" We stepped outside, moving to a small waiting area at the end of the corridor where we wouldn't be overheard. Phillips carried a leather portfolio, which he placed on the table between us. "First, I want to thank you for what you did," he began. "Without your actions, we might never have broken this case." He paused, his expression clouding. "But I also need to warn you, this isn't over. Not by a long shot." "Harrison and Davis are in custody," I pointed out. "Yes, but they're just 2 nodes in a network that spans multiple counties. We've identified at least 15 other individuals implicated in various crimes over the past 3 decades, some still in positions of power." He opened the portfolio, revealing a complex organizational chart with names, dates, and connections. "Your uncle's research was thorough, but even he didn't see the full scope." I studied the chart, recognizing many names from George's notes. Some were local businessmen, others county officials, a few state-level politicians. The connections between them formed a web of corruption that extended far beyond Pinewood Valley's boundaries. "The Blackwood case was just the beginning," Phillips continued. "Based on the evidence you recovered and what we've gathered independently, we're looking at multiple homicides, decades of corruption, evidence tampering, witness intimidation." He shook his head. "It's unprecedented in my 30 years with the department." "What happens now?" I asked. "Grand jury convenes next week. Harrison and Davis are facing multiple charges, including first-degree murder for Rachel Blackwood's death and conspiracy in your uncle's murder." He hesitated, then added, "But we've got a problem. Harrison's already hired the best defense team in the state. They're challenging the admissibility of much of the evidence, claiming illegal search and seizure." "But we had probable cause," I protested. "The map, the recordings," Phillips held up a hand. "I know, and I believe the evidence will ultimately be admitted. But these cases are never straightforward, especially when they involve people who've spent decades manipulating the legal system to their advantage." He slid a document across the table, a subpoena with my name on it. "You'll be called to testify both to the grand jury and at trial. It won't be easy. Harrison's lawyers will try to discredit you any way they can. Your professional history, your personal life, your actions since arriving in Pinewood Valley." I took the subpoena, the weight of it in my hands far greater than the paper it was printed on. I understand. There's more, Phillips said, his voice dropping. We found something in one of George's safe deposit boxes that you should see. He produced a sealed envelope and handed it to me. My name was written on the front in George's distinctive handwriting. This was in a box at First Montana Bank, Phillips explained. Opened 3 days before George died. Bank manager said he was explicit that it only be given to you in person. I broke the seal and withdrew several pages of handwritten notes along with the key that I didn't recognize in a small flash drive. I'll give you some privacy, Phillips said, standing. Call my cell when you're ready to discuss next steps. Alone in the waiting room, I began reading what appeared to be my uncle's final message. Nathan, if you're reading this, then I have either succeeded in exposing the truth about Pinewood Valley or more likely they've silenced me before I could finish what I started. Either way, the responsibility now falls to you. 30 years ago, I failed the woman I loved. I couldn't save Rachel from Victor Blackwood or the network that protected him. That failure has defined my life ever since. Every article I didn't write, every truth I didn't expose, all sacrificed to my obsession with one case that consumed me. But Rachel's murder was just the beginning. The network that killed her and covered it up has continued operating for decades, claiming more victims, burying more secrets. I've documented everything I could find, but I know there's more. Depths of corruption I couldn't reach alone. The enclosed key opens a storage locker at the bus station in Billings. Inside is everything I couldn't risk keeping in Pinewood Valley. Financial records, witness statements, photographic evidence, things that powerful men would kill to keep hidden. The flash drive contains my complete investigation. Yours if you're reading this. I've arranged for copies of all materials to be sent to trusted contacts in the national media if the drive isn't connected to the internet every 72 hours. Consider it your insurance policy. I know I have no right to ask anything of you. We were never close, and I bear much of the blame for that. Your father, my brother, warned me that my obsession was destroying everything that mattered, including family. He was right, as he often was. But you're a journalist, Nathan, a real one. Despite what the industry has become, you seek truth, not clicks. That's why I've left everything to you, not just property and possessions, but the burden of this story. The victims deserve justice. Rachel deserves justice. And Pinewood Valley deserves to be free of the men who've controlled it through fear for generations. Be careful who you trust. The network has roots everywhere, but know that you're not alone. There are others in Pinewood Valley who have helped me over the years. People who want the truth told, but have been too afraid to speak out. Whatever happens, remember this. Some stories cost everything to tell, but silence costs even more. Your Uncle George. The words blurred as unexpected tears filled my eyes. After a lifetime of distance, I finally understood the man who had been George Reed. Not the reclusive, paranoid figure others had described, but a man haunted by loss and driven by a relentless pursuit of justice. A man who, in his own way, had prepared me for this moment my entire life, following my career, saving my articles, waiting for the day when I might be ready to continue his work. I tucked the letter key and flash drive into my jacket pocket. There would be time to visit Billings later. For now, I needed to ensure Lisa's safety and prepare for what promised to be a grueling legal battle. When I returned to Lisa's room, she was awake, her dark eyes alert, despite the pain medication. Phillips was here, she said. It wasn't a question. I nodded, taking the chair beside her bed. Grand jury next week. We'll both be testifying. Harrison's lawyers will try to destroy you, she warned. They'll dig up everything. That plagiarism accusation from college, your divorce, the drinking after you lost the Pulitzer nomination. I stared at her, startled. How do you know about all that? A faint smile crossed her face. George kept files on everyone, said it was important to know who you could trust. Your file was extensive. And yet he trusted me with everything. I mused, still trying to process the idea that my uncle had investigated my life so thoroughly. He said you had one quality that mattered most. You couldn't walk away from the truth even when it cost you. She shifted, wincing at the movement. He was right, wasn't he? You could have left after finding the letters. Could have walked away when Davis warned you off. Could have fled with the evidence instead of coming to the mill to save me. I'm a journalist, I said simply, echoing George's words from his letter. Finding the truth is what I do. Yeah. Well, journalist, she replied, her voice strengthening, we've got a hell of a story to tell. The following morning, I drove to Billings to retrieve whatever George had left in the bus station locker. The key opened a large storage compartment containing 3 waterproof containers, each labeled meticulously with dates and contents. The material was staggering. Financial records showing bribes and payoffs dating back to the needed 70s. Photographic evidence of crime scenes that had been officially lost. Sworn statements from witnesses who had subsequently disappeared or died under suspicious circumstances. Most disturbing were the files on 6 women who had vanished between 1973 and 1998, each with connections to men in Harrison's network. I checked into a motel in Billings, unwilling to return to Pinewood Valley with such explosive material until I'd cataloged and copied everything. For 3 days, I barely slept, organizing George's research into a coherent narrative that connected decades of corruption and violence. On the 4th day, I received a call from Phillips. "We need you back in Pinewood Valley," he said without preamble. "There's been a development." "What kind of development?" "Harrison's been talking, offering to name names in exchange for considerations. And someone tried to access Ortega's hospital room last night. She's been moved to a secure location." "Is she okay?" "She's fine. Hospital security stopped the man before he got to her floor, but it's clear that elements of the network are still active and desperate." His voice lowered. "How soon can you be back?" 3 hours, I said, already gathering my materials. "I found George's storage locker in Billings. You're going to want to see what was inside." "Bring it directly to the state police barracks outside Pinewood Valley. Not into town," Phillips instructed. "And Nathan, watch your back. Harrison's reach extends further than we initially thought." The drive back to Pinewood Valley was tense. Each passing vehicle was a potential threat. I took a circuitous route, frequently checking my mirrors for signs of pursuit. The containers from George's locker were secured in the trunk, their contents potentially enough to bring down not just Harrison's local network, but officials at the county and possibly state level as well. About 20 miles outside Pinewood Valley, I noticed a black SUV that had been following at a consistent distance for several miles. It maintained the same speed, never quite closing the gap, but never falling far behind either. My instincts, honed by years of reporting in conflict zones, screamed danger. I increased my speed, slightly, watching to see if the SUV would do the same. It did, confirming my suspicions. I reached for my phone to call Phillips, only to find no signal, either a dead zone or, more worryingly, deliberate interference. The highway stretched empty ahead and behind, except for the pursuing vehicle. I was still 10 miles from the state police barracks, with few options for evasion on the open road. As I rounded a bend, I saw the reason for the SUV's confident pursuit. A roadblock ahead, 2 trucks positioned to prevent passage. This wasn't a police checkpoint. There were no lights, no official vehicles, just the trucks and several men standing beside them. A trap, almost certainly set by Harrison's remaining allies. I had seconds to decide. Stopping meant capture or worse. Attempting to run the blockade of my truck was risky at best, suicidal at worst. The ditch to my right was too steep to navigate, but to my left. I wrenched the wheel hard, sending the truck crashing through the guardrail and onto a logging road that ran parallel to the highway about 15 feet below. The impact was jarring, the truck bouncing violently as it hit the dirt track. But somehow the vehicle remained upright and moving. In my rearview mirror, I saw the black SUV skid to a halt at the break in the guardrail. 2 men emerged, weapons visible in their hands. They wouldn't risk the same maneuver I had, but they didn't need to. The logging road eventually reconnected with the highway several miles ahead, where they could easily intercept me. I accelerated down the rough track, the truck bouncing and sliding on the uneven surface. The logging road forked ahead, one branch continuing parallel to the highway, the other veering deeper into the forest. I took the second option, hoping to lose my pursuers in the dense woods. The track narrowed and worsened, becoming little more than a game trail in places. Branches scraped against the sides of the truck, and more than once I nearly lost control on steep inclines or sharp turns. But I kept moving, pushing deeper into unfamiliar territory, guided only by the position of the sun and my general sense of direction. After what felt like hours but was probably only 40 minutes, I emerged from the forest onto a narrow country road. A weathered sign indicated I was still in Pinewood County, about 12 miles west of town, well away from the state police barracks where Phillips was waiting, but also hopefully away from the men who had tried to intercept me. I reached for my phone again and was relieved to find a weak signal. I dialed Phillips immediately. "Where are you?" he demanded. "I've been trying to reach you for over an hour." "Someone set up a roadblock on Highway 47, I explained, keeping my voice as steady as possible. "Black SUV followed me from Billings. Had to take evasive action through the forest. I'm on County Road 22, I think west of town." Phillips swore softly. "Stay where you are. I'm sending a team to escort you in. Do not move. Do not approach anyone." "Understood." But Phillips, they knew I was coming back today. They knew my route. Someone had to have told them. There was a long silence before he responded. "I know we've got a leak. That's why I'm personally leading the team to retrieve you. Trust no one else." 30 tense minutes later, two unmarked vehicles approached from the direction of Pinewood Valley. I watched warily, ready to flee again if necessary, but relaxed when I saw Phillips in the lead car. 4 other agents accompanied him, all armed and clearly on high alert. "You okay?" Phillips asked as I emerged from my battered truck. "Been better," I admitted. "But I've got George's files intact." I gestured to the containers in the trunk. Phillips nodded to one of his agents who transferred the containers to their vehicle. "We're taking you to a safe house outside town. Ortega's already there. Neither of you is safe in Pinewood Valley right now." The safe house turned out to be a former ranger station about 15 miles from town, isolated and defensible with clear sight lines in all directions. Lisa was waiting inside, her arm in a sling, her face still bruised, but her eyes alert and determined. "Glad you made it," she said as I entered. "When Phillips said you disappeared, I thought, takes more than a roadblock to stop me," I replied, trying for lightness I didn't feel. "How are you feeling?" "Like I went 10 rounds with a grizzly, but I'll live." She nodded toward the containers Phillips's agents were bringing in. "Is that what I think it is?" "George's complete files. 30 years of investigation into Harrison's network." Phillips joined us, his expression grim. "We've got a secure perimeter established. You'll both stay here until the grand jury convenes. Too dangerous to have you in town with what we now know about the extent of the network." "Which is what exactly?" I asked. He gestured to the table where my laptop was already set up. "Show me what George found, and I'll fill in the gaps from our investigation." For the next several hours, the three of us pieced together the full extent of Harrison's criminal enterprise. It had begun in the early 1970s as a small-time operation. Protection money from local businesses covering up domestic violence cases for prominent men, manipulating property deals. But over decades, it had evolved into something far more sinister. The 6 missing women whose cases George had investigated were indeed all victims of men in Harrison's network. When they threatened to expose abuse or other crimes, they were eliminated, their disappearances disguised as voluntary departures or accidents. Sarah Mitchell had been just one in a long line of victims whose deaths had been covered up by corrupt officials. Phillips explained, pointing to bank records George had obtained. Harrison was careful about the violent crimes. Layers of cutouts, plausible deniability. But money leaves trails that can't be completely erased. We've traced bribes, kickbacks, and laundered funds through a dozen shell companies. "And Harrison's talking now," Lisa Voss asked, "naming accomplices." Phillips nodded. "He's 73, looking at multiple life sentences, offering information in exchange for considerations, already implicated 3 county commissioners and a state judge." "What about George?" I asked the question that had been haunting me since finding his letter. "Harrison admitted at the mill that he had my uncle killed. Do we have proof?" Phillips hesitated, exchanging a glance with Lisa before responding. "We've got Harrison's verbal admission from your confrontation at the mill. And the toxicology report from your uncle's autopsy showed traces of a substance that can induce cardiac arrest, virtually undetectable unless you're specifically looking for it. Between those and the timing, right before George was scheduled to meet with state investigators, we've got a solid case for premeditated murder." The revelation, while not unexpected after Harrison's admission, still hit me like a physical blow. George hadn't died peacefully in his sleep as I'd been told. He'd been murdered because he'd finally gathered enough evidence to expose decades of corruption and violence. "I want to be there," I said quietly, when they charge him with George's murder. I want to see his face. You will be, Phillips assured me, as the primary witness to his confession. Lisa reached across the table with her uninjured arm, her hand covering mine briefly. George would be proud of you, she said softly. You finished what he couldn't. And the grand jury convened the following week in the county courthouse in Billings, away from the influence of Pinewood Valley. For 3 days, I testified about everything I discovered since inheriting George's ranch. The letters, the map, the buried evidence on the Blackwood property, and finally the confrontation at the mill where Harrison had admitted to orchestrating George's murder. Lisa testified as well, her arm still in a sling, but her voice steady as she detailed her years of unofficial investigation and the events leading to her kidnapping and assault. Her testimony was particularly damaging to Davis, who had participated directly in her abduction and beating. When the proceedings concluded, the grand jury returned indictments against Harrison Davis and 13 other members of their network for crimes ranging from murder and conspiracy to obstruction of justice and financial fraud. It was, as Phillips later told us, one of the most extensive corruption cases in Montana's history. But the legal process was just beginning. Arrests had to be made, evidence processed, and trials prepared, all while ensuring the safety of key witnesses like Lisa and myself. We remained at the safe house, our movements restricted, and our communications monitored for security. It was during this period of enforced isolation that Lisa and I began to truly know each other. Beyond our shared connection to George and our commitment to exposing the truth, we discovered common ground in unexpected areas. A love of classic literature, a preference for mountains over oceans, even the same terrible taste in B-movies from the 1980s. Did you always want to be a cop? I asked one evening as we sat on the cabin's porch watching the sunset behind distant mountains. Actually, no, she admitted. I wanted to be a journalist like your uncle. Had a subscription to the Denver Post just to read his articles when I was in high school. What changed? My sister, she said simply. She was in an abusive relationship. Reported it multiple times, but the local police, who worked for Harrison, though I didn't know it then, never did anything. One day she just disappeared. Official reports said she left town, started fresh somewhere else, but she would have told me if that was the case. I'm so sorry, I said, understanding now the personal stake that had driven her investigation all these years. I became a cop because I thought I could change things from the inside, she continued. Make sure what happened to my sister didn't happen to anyone else. But Pinewood Valley was too far gone. The corruption was too entrenched. Until now, I reminded her. Harrison's network is being dismantled. The truth is finally coming out. She smiled faintly, though sadness lingered in her eyes. Yes, thanks to George. And you. And you, I insisted. Without your help, I would have been just another outsider asking inconvenient questions, easily dismissed or silenced. We fell silent, watching as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. In that moment, I felt a connection to this place, to the mountains, to the land George had left me, and to the woman beside me who had risked everything for truth and justice. 2 weeks after the grand jury indictments, Phillips arrived at the safe house with news. Harrison's talking, he announced without preamble. Not just about the murders we already knew about, but others. In exchange for avoiding the death penalty, he's giving up everything. Names, dates, locations of bodies. Including my sister, Lisa asked, her voice carefully controlled. Phillips nodded somberly. Amanda Ortega, 2003. Harrison claims Davis and a deputy named Tanner were directly responsible. They're searching the location he provided now. Lisa closed her eyes briefly, absorbing the confirmation of what she had suspected for 20 years. When she opened them again, there was both pain and relief in her gaze. At least we'll be able to bring her home. There's more, Phillips continued. Harrison implicated Councilman James Wheeler in George's murder. Says Wheeler provided the substance used to induce the heart attack and helped cover up the evidence afterward. The name hit me like a physical blow. James Wheeler was Pinewood Valley's most prominent citizen, owner of the largest real estate development company in the county, major political donor, and chairman of the town council. He'd been conspicuously absent from George's notes and investigations, appearing only as a peripheral figure in a few land transactions. Wheeler, I echoed in disbelief. He wasn't on any of our radar. That was by design, Phillips explained. According to Harrison, Wheeler was the network's insurance policy, the respectable face who maintained connections with state officials and kept the money flowing. He was careful never to be directly linked to any of the violent crimes, but Harrison says he authorized many of them, including George's murder. And you believe Harrison? I asked skeptically. We're corroborating everything, but initial searches of Wheeler's office and home have already yielded substantial evidence linking him to financial crimes, and his secretary has agreed to testify about messages she relayed between him and Harrison regarding George. The revelation that Wheeler, a man who had built his reputation as Pinewood Valley's most upstanding citizen, was at the heart of the corruption was stunning. It explained how the network had maintained its influence for so long, protected by a facade of respectability that few would think to question. What happens now? I asked. Wheeler's been arrested. Trial dates are being set for the major players. Phillips hesitated, then continued. And it's safe for you both to return to Pinewood Valley if you want to. The immediate threat has passed. Return to Pinewood Valley. The prospect was simultaneously appealing and daunting. Despite everything that had happened, George's ranch was now my home, the only real home I'd had in years, and there was still work to be done. Stories to be written, truths to be told about the women who had disappeared and the system that had failed them. I'm going back, I said with sudden certainty. George left me that ranch for a reason. It's where I'm supposed to be. Lisa studied me for a long moment, then nodded. I've got nowhere else to go, she said simply. My job with the sheriff's department is over, obviously, but maybe there's still a way I can help bring justice to Pinewood Valley. The following day, we returned to a town transformed. State police still patrolled the streets, and many businesses remained closed in the aftermath of the arrests. Citizens eyed us with a mixture of resentment, fear, and, from some, gratitude. We had exposed the corrupt power structure that had controlled their lives for generations. But in doing so, we had also shattered the illusion of Pinewood Valley as a peaceful, idyllic community. George's ranch was as we had left it, though state investigators had clearly been through the house and barn, documenting evidence and collecting materials relevant to the case. I stood in the center of the living room, surveying what was now indisputably my home, filled with the legacy of a man I had only truly begun to know after his death. What will you do now? Lisa asked, standing in the doorway, with her bag slung over her shoulder. She had nowhere to stay, her apartment in town being too closely associated with the sheriff's department for comfort. Right, I said simply. Tell the stories George couldn't. The missing women, the corruption, the cost of silence, and the courage of those who finally spoke out. I paused, then added, You're welcome to stay here. The ranch has plenty of room. She hesitated, then nodded. Just until I figure out my next steps, she agreed. The next few months passed in a blur of activity. I wrote a series of articles for the Denver Post detailing the Pinewood Valley corruption case, the decades of abuse and cover-ups, and the brave individuals who had helped expose the truth. The pieces garnered national attention, leading to interviews, speaking engagements, and eventually a book contract. Lisa found purpose in working with the state investigators, her intimate knowledge of Pinewood Valley and its power dynamics proving invaluable as they unraveled decades of corruption. When the state police established a permanent task force dedicated to investigating similar networks in rural communities, she was offered a position as a civilian consultant. The trials began in the spring, each one revealing new depths of depravity and corruption. Harrison, Davis, and Wheeler were all convicted of multiple counts of murder conspiracy and obstruction of justice. Dozens of lesser figures in the network received sentences for their roles in various crimes. The system that had protected abusers and silenced victims for decades was finally being dismantled, piece by corrupt piece. As summer approached, I turned my attention to a project that had been forming in my mind since returning to Pinewood Valley, transforming the barn where I had found Rachel's letters into a memorial for her and the other victims of Harrison's network. Are you sure about this? Lisa asked as we stood in the barn surveying the space that had once concealed so many secrets. It's a lot to take on. I'm sure, I replied. These women deserve to be remembered. Their stories deserve to be told. With the help of local craftsmen, many of whom had been silently opposed to Harrison's reign, but too afraid to speak out, we converted the barn into a simple but powerful memorial space. Photographs and brief biographies of each victim lined the walls, along with timelines of their cases and the systemic failures that had allowed their abusers to escape justice. At the center, where the wooden chest had been hidden, we placed a simple bronze plaque in memory of Rachel Blackwood and all those whose voices were silenced. Truth endures, justice prevails. The memorial opened to the public on October 15, 2024, the 31st anniversary of Rachel's death. Despite minimal publicity, dozens of people attended, including family members of some of the victims who had traveled from across the country to honor their loved ones. Among them was an elderly woman who approached me after the ceremony, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "I'm Dorothy Campbell," she said, extending a thin hand. "Rachel's sister." The name struck me instantly. The sister mentioned in Rachel's obituary who had lived out of state. "Miss Campbell," I said, taking her hand gently, "I can't tell you what it means that you're here." "I came as soon as I read your articles," she explained. "All these years I thought Rachel died in an accident. To learn the truth," she shook her head, words failing momentarily. "It's painful, but also a relief to finally know." We talked for over an hour as the other attendees gradually departed. Dorothy shared stories about Rachel that weren't in any police file or newspaper article. Her love of painting, her dream of opening a small bookstore, her quiet determination despite years of abuse. "She stayed with Victor because she believed she had no choice," Dorothy explained. "In those days in a town like this, a woman couldn't just leave an influential man. She'd have nowhere to go, no way to support herself. George was her hope for a different life." As she prepared to leave, Dorothy pressed a small velvet pouch into my hand. "This was Rachel's," she said. "I've kept it all these years, never knowing what to do with it. But I think George would want you to have it now." Inside the pouch was a silver locket on a delicate chain. When I opened it, I found a faded photograph of a young George Reed smiling in a way I'd never seen in life. On the opposite side was an inscription, "Two hearts, one soul always. G." The simple gift affected me more deeply than I could have anticipated. It was tangible proof of the love that had existed between George and Rachel, the connection that had driven him to spend 30 years seeking justice for her death. That evening, after all the visitors had gone and Lisa had retired to her room, I sat alone on the porch of the ranch house, the locket resting in my palm. The Montana night spread vast and star-filled above me, the same sky George and Rachel had gazed upon decades earlier, dreaming of a future together that would never come. In the months since discovering the truth about Pinewood Valley, I had written thousands of words about corruption, violence, and justice delayed but finally delivered. I had helped expose a criminal network that had operated with impunity for generations. I had seen men who thought themselves untouchable finally face consequences for their actions. But sitting there with Rachel's locket in my hand, I realized that the most important story wasn't about the criminals or the corruption or even the long process of bringing them to justice. It was about the victims, Rachel Blackwood, Lisa's sister Amanda, and all the others whose lives had been cut short by powerful men who believed they could act without consequence. Their stories deserve to be told, not just as victims of a corrupt system, but as individuals with hopes, dreams, and lives that mattered. That would be my next project, a book honoring their memories, ensuring they were remembered for how they lived, not just how they died. I placed the locket carefully in the memorial the next morning alongside Rachel's photograph. It seemed fitting that this symbol of her love for George should rest in the place where their story had begun for me, where a hidden wooden chest had set in motion events that would finally bring justice after 30 years. Pinewood Valley was changing. With Harrison's network dismantled and the corrupt officials removed, the town was slowly finding its way toward a new identity. It would take time to heal the wounds inflicted by decades of fear and silence, but the process had begun. As for me, I had found an unexpected home in George's ranch and an unexpected purpose in continuing his work. The journalist who had arrived in Pinewood Valley months earlier, cynical adrift, unsure of his place in the world, had been transformed by the pursuit of truth and justice just as George had intended. Lisa joined me on the porch that evening, 2 mugs of coffee in her hands. She had finally discarded the sling, though she still moved with the caution of someone healing from serious injuries. "What happens now?" she asked, handing me one of the mugs. "Book tour back to Denver. You've got options again." I gazed out at the mountains silhouetted against the setting sun, considering her question. "I'm staying," I said finally. "This is home now. There are more stories to tell, more truths to uncover." I turned to her, seeing not just a colleague in the pursuit of justice, but something more, a friend, a partner, perhaps eventually something deeper. What about you? The state position is permanent if you want it. She smiled, the expression transforming her face in the golden evening light. I'm staying too, she said simply. Pinewood Valley needs people who remember, who won't let the past be buried again. She paused, then added, her eyes meeting mine. Besides, I've got a feeling the best stories are still waiting to be told. As darkness fell over the Montana landscape, I thought of George and Rachel, whose love had endured even after death, inspiring a 3-decade quest for justice that had finally culminated in truth. I thought of the memorial in the barn, honoring lives cut short but not forgotten. And I thought of the future stretching before me, uncertain but full of purpose, shaped by the legacy I had inherited and the truths I had helped uncover. Some stories cost everything to tell, but silence costs even more. George had understood that truth, had lived it for 30 years. Now it was my turn to carry that understanding forward, to use my voice for those who had been silenced, to ensure that justice, however delayed, would finally be served. In the distance, a coyote called, the sound echoing across the valley like a reminder that some things endure despite all attempts to silence them. Truth, memory, justice, and the courage to pursue them no matter the cost. 6 months later, I stood in the crowded courthouse in Billings, watching as James Wheeler was led away in handcuffs. The jury had taken less than 4 hours to find him guilty on all counts: conspiracy to commit murder, obstruction of justice, racketeering. The judge had sentenced him to life without parole, to be served consecutively with his sentences for financial crimes. As the courtroom emptied, Phillips approached, satisfaction evident in his tired eyes. That's the last of them, he said. All 17 indictments, 17 convictions. Your uncle would be proud. I nodded, thinking of the long journey that had brought us here. The trials had been grueling, months of testimony, evidence, cross-examinations. Harrison's lawyers had done it exactly as Lisa had predicted, digging into my past, questioning my credibility, trying to paint me as a failed journalist desperate for a career-saving story. But the evidence had been too strong, the testimony too consistent. One by one, the network's members had fallen, their power stripped away, their crimes exposed to the light. What happens to Pinewood Valley now? I asked Phillips as we walked from the courthouse into the bright spring afternoon. Rebuilding on, he replied. New elections next month. State oversight for the foreseeable future. It'll take time, but towns can heal from this kind of corruption. I've seen it before. Have you? This extensive? He considered for a moment. No, he admitted. This was something different. Special in its evil, but special in how it ended too. He glanced at me. Most of these cases never break. Too much fear, too little evidence. Without George's groundwork and your willingness to pick up where he left off. He left the thought unfinished, but I understood. Without George's obsessive documentation, without Lisa's inside knowledge, without the courage of witnesses like Eleanor Chen and Doris Harrison's network might have continued for another generation. Back at the ranch, I found Lisa in the barn, now the memorial, speaking quietly with a young woman I didn't recognize. As I approached, I realized they were standing before the photograph of Amanda Ortega, Lisa's sister. Nathan, Lisa said, noticing me. This is Jenna Martinez. She was Amanda's roommate in college. Jenna extended her hand. I read your articles. I had to come see this place to understand what happened to Amanda. For 20 years, I've wondered. We found her, Lisa said, her voice steady despite the emotion in her eyes. Based on Harrison's confession, she's being reburied next week in the family plot. You're welcome to attend. I'd be honored, Jenna replied. Then to me, what you've done here, giving these women back their stories, their dignity, it matters. Amanda would have approved. After Jenna left, Lisa and I walked the perimeter of the property in companionable silence. The land was coming alive with spring, new grass pushing through the soil buds forming on the trees, wildflowers beginning to appear in protected hollows. Nature's reminder that renewal follows even the harshest seasons. Wheeler's conviction was on the news, Lisa said finally. National coverage. People are calling it one of the most significant corruption cases in decades. It's not about the headlines, I replied. It's about the victims. Always was. She nodded. I know. But the attention means something. It means other towns might look more closely at their power structures. Other victims might find the courage to speak up. We reached the fence line where the property met national forest land. Mountains rose in the distance, their peaks still white with snow despite the warming temperatures in the valley. I got a call from a producer in New York, I said. They want to make a documentary about the case, about George and Rachel, about the network, about how it all came down. Are you going to do it? I shrugged. I don't know. There's value in spreading the story wider, but I'm wary of turning tragedy into entertainment. You'd make sure it was done right, Lisa said confidently, with respect for the victims. Maybe, I turned to face her, but I'd want your input, your approval. This is your story too. She smiled, the expression reaching her eyes now in a way it rarely had when we first met. The months since the arrest had been healing for her, finding her sister's remains, seeing her killers brought to justice, building a new life from the ashes of the old. Our story, she corrected, and George's and Rachel's. When we returned to the house, I found a package waiting on the porch. No return address, just my name in unfamiliar handwriting. Inside was a single sheet of paper and a small, leather-bound book. The note was brief. Found this in my mother's effects after she passed. Thought you should have it. Dorothy Campbell. The book was Rachel Blackwood's diary covering the last year of her life. I handled it reverently, this precious artifact that had somehow survived 3 decades while its owner had not. Are you going to read it? Lisa asked softly. I don't know, I admitted. It feels invasive even now. Or maybe it's what she would have wanted, for her own words to be heard finally, for her truth to be known. That night I sat at George's desk, my desk now, and carefully opened the diary. The first entry was dated January 1st, 1993. New Year's resolution. This is the year I leave. This is the year I find courage. This is the year I choose life. Rachel's voice clear and determined, reaching across decades. I read until dawn, absorbing her hopes, her fears, her love for George, her terror of Victor. The diary ended 3 days before her death with words that brought tears to my eyes. Packed a small bag and hid it in the old oak's hollow. Told no one but George. Friday night I'll be free. I'll be alive again. After all these years of half-living, I'll be whole. She never got her chance at freedom, at wholeness. Victor and Harrison had seen to that. But in a way, she had achieved a kind of immortality. Her story had exposed a corrupt system, had saved other women from similar fates, had transformed a town. I placed the diary carefully in the memorial the next day, alongside the locket and photographs. Another piece of Rachel restored, another truth uncovered. Spring turned to summer, and the ranch took on new life. I planted a vegetable garden in the rich Montana soil, repaired fences, painted the house. Lisa's position with the state task force kept her busy, but she continued to stay at the ranch, her few possessions gradually integrating with mine until it was hard to remember a time when she hadn't been there. My book about the case was taking shape chapter by chapter. Not a sensationalized true crime narrative, but a thoughtful examination of power, corruption, and the cost of silence. I wanted to honor the victims by telling their stories completely, not just their deaths, but their lives, their dreams, their resistance. One warm July evening, as we sat on the porch watching a thunderstorm build over the mountains, Lisa handed me an envelope. What's this? I asked. Open it. Inside was a deed, the adjacent property to the east, 50 acres of pristine woodland with a small creek running through it. I don't understand, I said. It's the Blackwood land, Lisa explained. The part that wasn't developed. It went up for auction last month. Tax sale. I bid on it. You bought Rachel's land? She nodded. I thought maybe we could expand the memorial, create some kind of retreat center, a place where other journalists could come to work on similar stories, a place that honors what George stood for. The idea struck me as perfect, a fitting tribute to both Rachel and George, a way to ensure their legacy continued. The George Reed Center for Investigative Journalism, I mused, helping reporters expose corruption and abuse of power in rural communities. Exactly. Lisa's eyes shone with enthusiasm. We could offer grants, workspace resources, create a network of our own, but one that serves truth instead of burying it. It would take money connections. I've already talked to your editor at the Denver Post. He's interested. And that producer in New York. She thinks she could help with fundraising. There are people who believe in this work, Nathan. People who support it. I stood walking to the edge of the porch, looking out over the land that had become my home. The storm was closer now, lightning illuminating the dark clouds, but no rain yet. Just the electric anticipation of change. It's a big undertaking, I said finally. Too big. I turned back to her, smiling. No, just right. The work began in August. Architects, builders, lawyers, all the necessary pieces to transform a vision into reality. We preserved the original memorial in the barn, but expanded it to include an archive of George's materials, a research library, and comfortable workspaces for visiting journalists. On Rachel's land, we built a series of small cabins, retreats where writers could work in solitude while still being part of a supportive community. The creek was cleared and restored, the overgrown fields transformed into meadows of native wildflowers. Throughout the construction, packages arrived regularly from across the country, files from journalists who had worked with George over the years, photographs, recordings, letters. Each sender included a note explaining their connection to him, how he had helped them, mentored them, encouraged them when no one else would. I began to understand that George's influence had extended far beyond what I had imagined. Though he had retreated from public life, he had continued to shape journalism from behind the scenes, advising young reporters, providing research to others when he couldn't publish himself, keeping alive the tradition of investigative reporting that spoke truth to power. The first group of resident journalists arrived in May of the following year, 5 reporters working on stories ranging from environmental corruption in Wyoming to domestic violence cover-ups in Idaho. They brought with them not just their investigations, but their passion, their determination to uncover truths others wanted hidden. Standing with Lisa at the dedication ceremony, watching as Dorothy Campbell cut the ribbon to officially open the George Reed Center for Investigative Journalism, I felt a profound sense of rightness. This was why George had left me the ranch. This was why he had preserved all those files, all that evidence. Not just to solve one case, but to create something lasting, a place where the work could continue long after he was gone. The plaque beside the entrance bore a simple inscription, "For George Reed and Rachel Blackwood, who believe that truth matters, and for all those who continue their fight." Later that evening, as the celebration wound down and our guests departed for their cabins, Lisa and I walked to the small hilltop cemetery where George was buried. Rachel's remains had been moved there as well after exhumation and proper identification. Reunited with George at last. The setting sun painted the valley in hues of gold and crimson, the beauty a stark contrast to the dark stories that had brought us here. But perhaps that was appropriate. Light and shadow, truth and deception, life and death, all part of the same complex tapestry. "Do you think they know?" Lisa asked softly, looking at the 2 simple headstones side by side. "Do you think they know what's happened here?" "I hope so," I replied. "I hope George knows his work mattered, that he didn't fail Rachel after all, that justice came even if it took 30 years. And I hope Rachel knows she's remembered not as a victim, but as the catalyst for change. Her courage in planning to leave and standing up to Victor, it started all of this." We stood in silence for a moment, paying our respects to the 2 people whose love story had transformed a town, exposed decades of corruption, and ultimately brought us together. As we turned to leave, I noticed a figure standing at the edge of the cemetery, a young woman in her 20s watching us with curious eyes. "Can I help you?" I called. She approached hesitantly. "I'm sorry to intrude. I'm Melissa Tanner. I'm a journalism student at Montana State. I read your book and I wanted to see this place for myself." "You're always welcome here," Lisa told her warmly. "That's what the center is for." "I've been working on a story," Melissa said, her words coming faster now, as if she'd been holding them back, "about a cluster of missing women in a town in Idaho. The police there say there is no connection, but I've found patterns, similar to what happened here. I don't have much evidence yet, but I believe these women were targeted because they tried to leave abusive relationships." I exchanged a glance with Lisa, recognizing the familiar pattern, the cycle that continued despite all our efforts to break it. "Come to the main house," I said. "Let's talk about your investigation. Maybe we can help." As we walked back down the hill, Melissa between us enthusiastically describing her research, I felt a sense of continuity, the torch being passed to a new generation. George's work hadn't ended with the exposure of Harrison's network. Rachel's story hadn't concluded with justice for her murder. They lived on in this place in the center that bore their legacy and the journalists who would continue to shine light into darkness. The following morning, I rose early and walked alone to the memorial barn. The first rays of sunlight streamed through the windows, illuminating the photographs on the walls. Rachel, Amanda, and the other victims of Harrison's network, their faces peaceful now, their stories told. I stood before Rachel's photograph, studying the young woman whose death had set so much in motion. "We did it," I said softly. "George kept his promise to you. The truth came out. The men who hurt you paid for their crimes. And something good has grown from all that pain." Outside, I could hear the sounds of the center coming to life. Voices in the cabins, a car arriving, the distant laughter of the young journalists who had come to learn and work. The future building on the foundation of the past. My phone buzzed with a text from Lisa. "Breakfast ready when you are." Phillips called. "They've found 3 more victims from Harrison's network. He wants to talk to us about adding them to the memorial." The work wasn't finished. It might never be. But that was all right. George had spent 30 years pursuing justice, and now I understood why. Some stories demanded to be told, no matter how long it took, no matter the cost. I took one last look at Rachel's photograph before leaving the memorial. "Thank you," I whispered, "for showing us the way." Outside, the Montana morning spread before me. Vast skies, distant mountains, the ranch and center bathed in golden light. Not the life I had expected when I arrived at this remote property months ago, inheriting a legacy I didn't understand. But the right life nonetheless. The necessary one. I walked toward the main house, toward Lisa, and the day's work toward the future we were building together. Behind me, the memorial stood as a testament to the past. Not just to tragedy and loss, but to resilience, to truth that refused to stay buried, to justice that arrived late, but arrived nonetheless. George had been right all along. Some stories cost everything to tell, but silence costs even more. It was a lesson I would carry forward, a truth I would honor with every word I wrote, every journalist I mentored, every secret I helped bring to light. In the end, that was the true inheritance. Not the ranch or the evidence or even the quest for justice, but the understanding that truth matters, that it's worth fighting for, worth sacrificing for, worth building a life around. And in Pinewood Valley, Montana, on land that had witnessed both terrible darkness and remarkable courage, that understanding had finally taken root and begun to grow. A legacy that would endure long after all of us were gone.